Today's hearing of the Congressional-Executive Commission on China on Tibet, barriers to settling an unresolved conflict will come to order. More than 70 years after the invasion that led to Chinese rule in Tibet, Tibetans continue to struggle in the face of unrelenting opposition. Chinese authorities routinely violate Tibetans' freedoms of religion, expression, and assembly, as well as denying Tibetans self-determination. The Chinese Communist Party has waged a years-long campaign of Sinicization, requiring conformity with officially sanctioned interpretations of religion and culture, not the authentic practice and teaching of Tibetan Buddhism. Contrary to that practice and teaching, the Chinese government even insists on its own authority to select the next reincarnation of the Dalai Lama, who authorities label a security threat. Those who express reverence to the Dalai Lama are punished. Also punished are those who express dissatisfaction with Chinese rule in Tibet. These punishments range from warnings to surveillance to interrogation and detention.
And the Tibetan people must be free to practice their own faith and to choose their own spiritual leaders. And again, we look forward to our distinguished witnesses for giving us guidance on the path forward. I yield back.
Thank you very much, Congressman. And we'd now like to introduce those witnesses. I'll introduce all of them at the beginning. Michael von Welt von Prague is a professor of international law and executive president of CREDA, an international non-governmental organization created to help prevent and resolve violent interstate conflicts. He is the author of Tibet Brief 2020, and he previously served as legal advisor to the office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Hon-Shiang Lau is a retired professor who taught at the City University of Hong Kong, Oklahoma State University, and Washington State University. Since retiring, he has devoted his time to Chinese history. He is the author of the book, Tibet Was Never Part of China Since Antiquity. Tenzing Taitong is a former Tibetan government official and representative of His Holiness the Dalai Lama to North America. He served in several roles in the Central Tibetan Administration, including as Kalon Tripa, the equivalent of Prime Minister. He has served as the director of the Tibetan Language Service at Radio Free Asia and is currently the director of the Tibetan Language Service at Voice of America, and he is testifying in his personal capacity. And Ellen Bork will be joining us by Zoom. She is contributing editor at the American Purpose. She previously served as a senior professional staff member for Asia on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and writes frequently about U.S. policy toward Tibet, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Her writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Dispatch, the Washington Post, and other publications. Thank you all for joining us for this hearing, and without objection, your full statements will be entered into the record. We ask that you keep your oral remarks to about 5 minutes. And so we'll start with... thank you very much, and we'll now turn to Professor Lau.
I want to thank this distinguished audience for enabling me to make this presentation. My theme is China's pre-1949 official historical records clearly show that Tibet was never part of China before the PRC invaded Tibet in 1950. This is an important issue because China is a signatory to the relevant covenants of the League of Nations and the United Nations, which means that since 1919, China has promised not to gain territories through military conquest thereafter. Moreover, the PRC incessantly condemns other countries for their past colonial conquests and the past bullying of China. Therefore, the PRC needs to cover up its 1950 Tibet conquest as a unification of a territory that has been part of China since antiquity. Sadly, today many governments incorrectly believe this ridiculous lie, and this is part of the reason why many Western democracies fail to provide adequate support for upholding Tibet's sovereignty. There are two important foundation concepts behind my theme. Foundation A, there is an abundance of authentic and reliable pre-1949 Chinese official historical records. The PRC version of Chinese history is very, very different from the version of Chinese history reflected in these pre-1949 official Chinese records. Foundation B, we use a comprehensive range of objective criteria to examine whether Tibet was part of China. Thus, to judge whether Tibet was part of China during China's Ming Dynasty, we use official classical Chinese records to examine, for example, number one, whether the Ming Empire had designated Tibet as part of China or as a foreign entity, say via a promulgated map. Number two, was the Ming Empire able to conduct census or collect taxes in Tibet? Number three, was the Ming Empire able to appoint or dismiss judges or governing officials in Tibet? Number four, was China's language, legal system, and monetary system used in Tibet, etc., etc. Combining foundations A and B, we can prove the following conclusion. China's pre-1949 official records clearly show that Tibet was never part of China before PRC's 1950 invasion. We also prove that PRC's so-called evidence of sovereignty over Tibet are based on not only distortions, but outright fabrications and forgeries of pre-1949 Chinese records. This means that a current permanent member of the UN Security Council militarily conquered a foreign country in 1950 and continues to subjugate it today. This crime obligates the intervention of the international community. I'm going to show you examples of these proofs. The first example is of a Ming Dynasty map. It's on your tablet. This is labeled as map 1, purported to show the entire Ming Empire. Regarding my foundation A stated earlier, this proof is from a Ming Dynasty 1461 AD government publication. That is, it comes from a very authoritative Chinese source. Regarding my foundation B, it relates to an objective sovereignty claim, depiction on a national map. This map labels, if you look at the map, you will show that the Chinese territories, the labels are framed in white lettering on black background. In contrast, it labels non-Chinese territories such as Japan in the east, and then Tibet over here on the west, in non-framed black lettering on white background. The contrast is literally in black and white. In other words, the Ming government clearly declares that Tibet is a non-China foreign entity. If you would flip the tablet, you would see that map number 2 is an example of a Qing Dynasty proof. This is from a Qing Dynasty 1732 government publication, purported to show the entire Qing Empire. On this map, the Qing government shows the position corresponding to today's Tibet Autonomous Region, which is the TAR, as a blank space. Hundreds of similar proofs are presented in this book that I've written. Most of them involve textual records and not just merely pictorial proofs like this, and they are, of course, much more reliable. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And we're now going to turn to Co-Chairman McGovern.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me thank all the panelists for being here. And let me make clear, the reason why we're doing this hearing, the reason why we've done other hearings on Tibet, the reason why we have passed legislation on Tibet is because China is not living up to the expectations of the international community with regard to Tibet. And, you know, I think there might be a perception in China that the world will soon forget and move on to something else. But I hope we're making it clear that that's not going to be the case. In fact, activity in the United States Congress on Tibet has intensified in recent years. More attention is being devoted to Tibet. And some of the topics that we're talking about here today, many members of Congress are unaware of. And they will be enlightened by this hearing. And it will bring additional perspective as we deal with other legislation impacting China in the future. So I just say to the government of China, who always gets annoyed when we do these hearings, you know what? You have a Tibet problem, and you can deal with it. You can go back to the negotiating table. I mean, that would be a good first step. And let's try to resolve these differences. But as long as you don't, as long as you pretend that there's not a problem here, please be assured that activity on Tibet, focus on Tibet in the United States and in other countries around the world will intensify. So, Professor Lau, would you say that the Chinese government's insistence that the Dalai Lama say that Tibet has been part of China since antiquity is tantamount to a demand that the Dalai Lama say something that is false?
Absolutely, I agree with that 100%. The PRC knows that that claim is a lie, and they are forcing the Dalai Lama to lie with the PRC.
Thank you. Mr. Van, so again, I think that there is a renewed interest in the United States and in other countries around the world. You know, as we witnessed yesterday, talking to parliamentarians from all over the world who are in Washington to find ways to support the Tibetan people, that I think things are changing globally. And I wish they had changed a long time ago, but they're now changing. My time is up right now. I'm going to recognize Senator Ossoff.
Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our panelists. I'd like to ask each of our panelists to comment on the intersection of press freedom and the issue at hand today. Last week in the commission, we heard from Undersecretary Zaya, who committed to me to work with my office to expand press freedom internationally and strengthen U.S. leadership for press freedom. My question, please, beginning with you, Mr. Tong, is how does the CCP repress freedom of reporting and publication within Tibet, more broadly within China? How does the CCP seek to influence reporting and publication on related issues internationally? Thank you. Ms. Lau.
Thank you. I'm not an expert in this area and have nothing of value to add, but I would like to use this opportunity to emphasize something else that was brought up just now. China or the Qing Empire never had any power in selecting the Dalai Lama, and that's clearly reflected in the official Chinese records. The Qing Empire only made a request to the Tibetans to use a golden urn to do one minor step of the selection by drawing lots, and that was all. And even that request was not consistently followed or acceded by the Tibetan authorities during the Qing dynasty. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Congressman, if you could just repeat the crux of your question again, because it kind of went in and out.
So. With the current abuses by CCP to oppress autonomous regions, what should the United States and other countries work together to stand with the Tibet people? And can global corporate companies play a role in raising awareness about the Tibet oppression?
Actually, I would like to comment on the earlier topic that you brought up. I think it's important for the world to realize that the Tibet issue is not necessarily just a China issue. I read in the mainstream newspaper articles in the past several days that they have pointed out that Putin is going to recreate the old Russian Empire by bringing up all this historical justification of sort of territorial rights even over the Baltic nations. If you look at the Chinese records clearly show that Tibet wasn't part of China but it does indicate that Burma and Korea and Thailand and Laos and a whole bunch of these areas were clearly part of China. It also indicates that even countries like Holland and Portugal were tributary countries to China. So as we have seen what has developed in the Putin's and in Ukraine's case, if we do not explicitly reject this kind of an attitude, there is always a possibility, a strong possibility, that 20 years from now, when China becomes even stronger, then they're going to bring up these old claims of sovereignty over Korea and over Vietnam, and then, as I've said, even over Portugal. And I think that's the point that I would like to make. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those answers. And the CCP continues to have oversight of Tibetan religious life by mandating political education for monks and nuns, creating apparatus to surveil and manage monastic institutions. Can you expand more on how the CCP authorities continue to reorient Tibetan society? I think maybe Professor Lau.
Actually, I would like to comment on the earlier topic that you brought up. I think it's important for the world to realize that the Tibet issue is not necessarily just a China issue. I read in the mainstream newspaper articles in the past several days that they have pointed out that Putin is going to recreate the old Russian Empire by bringing up all this historical justification of sort of territorial rights even over the Baltic nations. If you look at the Chinese records clearly show that Tibet wasn't part of China, but it does indicate that Burma and Korea and Thailand and Laos and a whole bunch of these areas were clearly part of China. It also indicates that even countries like Holland and Portugal were tributary countries to China. So as we have seen what has developed in the Putin's and in Ukraine's case, if we do not explicitly reject this kind of an attitude, there is always a possibility, a strong possibility, that 20 years from now, when China becomes even stronger, then they're going to bring up these old claims of sovereignty over Korea and over Vietnam, and then, as I've said, even over Portugal. And I think that's the point that I would like to make. Thank you.
Mr. Lau, are the maps and documents that you cite available in archives inside of China? And do researchers and historians in China have access to the information? And to what extent is this information digitized and online or otherwise available at libraries outside of China?
Thank you for your question, but please allow me to answer a preceding question.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I want to add to what Michael has said about self-determination. The Chinese Communist Party, in the earlier version of the party constitution in the 1930s, repeatedly affirmed the self-determination rights of the so-called minorities with explicit sentence stating that up to the level of independence and seceding from China. In other words, they practically advocate, if not at least agree to the rights of the Tibetans and, well, actually the Xinjiang Uyghurs too, to form independent countries. They only deleted those clauses after they gained power after 1949. Is that okay? Now to answer your question. Actually, in my book, which is written in Chinese, and my target audience is people in China, I wanted to sort of convince the people in China that they haven't done the right thing with respect to Tibet. So I have actually taken totally Chinese chauvinistic approach. I dismiss all Tibetan records. I dismiss all Western records. I only use Chinese records that are authored by Chinese, written in the Chinese language from the 13th century up till 1949, before the Chinese Communist Party took power. And I also restrict myself to only these old records that were reprinted by the People's Republic of China, indicating their acceptance of the authoritativeness of these publications. And yes, most of them are digitized by companies or libraries under the PRC rule. And I think actually 80% of them are not only available and digitized, they are available free of charge in public websites. And I very explicitly tell my readers, don't believe in a single word that is in this book. Go to the internet and check it up yourself. The two maps that I'm showing over here, they are available for free on websites. Many of them operated within the PRC. Many of them operated by official units of the PRC.
So maybe President Xi ought to visit the library or go online.
Well,
Yeah. Professor Lau, Mr. Van Walt's books argue that it is inappropriate, if I'm mischaracterizing your books, correct me, that it is inappropriate to apply the modern definition of sovereignty to Tibet and its neighbors because ruling powers in East Asia related to each other in ways that were distinct from the Western notion of sovereignty, that was applied later. Does your research conform to this view, and how would you characterize Tibet's relations with its neighbors over the centuries?
thank you for the question. As far as I could tell, there are many places where in the Chinese official records, many entities were referred to as countries, which is in Chinese, Guo, the country, and Tibet was also referred to as a country, Guo, just like Vietnam and just like Holland and these other countries. So now, if you look at the history of Tibet over the past 1,000 years, they are not that dissimilar or that different from the histories of Germany or China or whatever. And there's sometime there was unified into a central administration, and other times it was fragmented, and there were all these principalities. And so I guess your question itself would take hours to debate, and I'm not good enough to answer the question. Certainly, by the Qing Empire's time, well, actually, even before that, I think by the 15th to the 16th century, Tibet became sufficiently unified, and they had all the structure of a government, such as legal codes, taxation, central taxation, so forth, that would qualify to be a country. But I have always felt that that's, pardon me for saying this, it's a less relevant question. The more relevant question is that, was Tibet part of China? And if Tibet wasn't part of China, to put it bluntly, it's really none of your business whether Tibet itself was a country. So on one hand, I would say, yes, Tibet was definitely a country compared to the standards that would be applicable to China and Germany since the 15th century or so. But again, I want to repeat that that's probably an unnecessary sort of a confusion to the issue. The more important issue is that nobody has the right to judge whether Tibet was a country. The more important thing was that was Tibet part of somebody else's territory, and if it's not, then leave Tibet alone.
In a May press conference with the Japanese Prime Minister, President Biden said, "I believe what Putin is attempting to do is eliminate the identity of Ukraine, the identity. He can't occupy it, but he can try to destroy its identity." And, I think those words are true with what Putin is trying to do in Ukraine, but I think they're also applicable to what China is trying to do in Tibet. How should we view Tibet through the lens of what President Biden's comment about eliminating the identity of Ukraine? And I will ask you all to respond, and anything that you think we should add for the record, this is the time to make that clear as well. So why don't we begin with Mr. Lau?
Well, I would like to reiterate 2 points. The first point is that I hope the United States and other governments would sort of counter and directly the claims of some of these empire revivalists, and we are seeing that, of course, in Putin's case, and then very likely a few years later we'll see that explicitly expressed in China, that they can use historical fabrications to sort of justify their attempts to reunify ancestral lands. And that really comes to the second point, and that is I hope that in future in schools throughout the world, that people will try to change this ingrained perception, and I know very much it's very deeply ingrained in Chinese like us, and that it's very important for you to be a national of a big country, of a powerful country. They somehow believe that that is essential to the well-being. My background is that I was born in Singapore, and of course I've seen countries like Liechtenstein and Switzerland, and people in Singapore and Liechtenstein, they have no interest in enlarging the country, and people can live very well. But people who are educated in Russia and China, it never came to their mind that they could live happily ever after if they lose Xinjiang or Ukraine or Tibet or whatever it is. They think it's the end of the world if our country, is splintered and then Tibet is gone and then Xinjiang is gone. I think it's important for us to, using the voice of America, whatever, is to somehow try to tell people explicitly that people in Switzerland and Liechtenstein live very well. This is all the message that I have.
Thank you. Mr. Tejon. The Chinese government, look, I mean, if you want to do something constructive right now, you should re-enter the direct dialogue that you walked away from 12 years ago. This issue is not going away. And so I appreciate everybody being here. I want to thank all the witnesses for their testimony. Without objection, I'd like to enter into the record a written statement from the International Campaign for Tibet and an additional paper by Professor Lau. The record will remain open until the close of business on Friday, June 24th, for any items that members would like to submit for the record or any additional questions for the witnesses. And with that, the hearing is adjourned.